The session. Welcome. This is the second Ask the Author session organized by the International Transport Forum at the OECD. This is a new format where we've launched to make the results of our reports available for you online and for you to be able to ask the author questions. We hold these about a week after the report is launched to give people time to browse through the findings and actually come up with questions that they may have. So this report is called Good to Go, Assessing the Environmental Performance of New Mobility in Cities. And it's touching upon a subject that is what you call a hot topic, I think, in many countries around the world, in many cities, is actually new mobility, ride sourcing, micromobility, e-scooters, all these things, helping the environment and helping to get towards low carbon and zero emission transport or not. And Pierpaolo Cazzola and our colleagues have worked on that in the context of a project by the Corporate Partnership Board, which is ITF's mechanism and platform to cooperate with the private sector to look at these questions. Pierpaolo will talk for about 10 minutes, and then you'll have 20 minutes to ask questions. Please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, not into the chat, in the Q&A, because that will allow me to keep track. And I'll then ask them to Pierpaolo. So without no further ado, here's the author of Good to Go, Assessing the Environmental Performance of New Mobility in Cities, Pierpaolo Cazzola. Pierre, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Nice to meet you all virtually. Just let me know if there's anything that doesn't work, Michael. So I'm going to walk you through a presentation with the key findings and recommendations of the report. First, a couple of words on the background. So the reason why we did this is that transport is undergoing lots of developments related with digital connectivity and electrification. And a lot of this is happening in cities. So we thought it was a good moment to try to better understand the impact of new services that are emerging in cities, thanks to these two key macro trends. We decided to focus on passenger transport, and also we decided to focus on two key aspects of the impacts, which are energy demand and CO2 emissions. Reasons for that is, well, CO2 emissions are, if you want, not by my own words, but by Antonio Guterres, is the defining element of our time, and energy demand is an extremely interesting space, subject to lots of transition right now. So we thought it was a good, was an ideal moment to look into that. So what do we do to develop this project? We looked at all life cycle components. So we took new mobility and looked at what they mean in terms of energy demand and emissions across vehicle manufacturing, vehicle use, which is including tank to wheel and vehicle use and fuel production. So vehicle use meaning if you burn fuels, tank to wheel emissions, and if you produce it upstream, well, what are the well to tank emissions? And if you don't, if you are talking about electrified vehicles, then most of everything comes practically from the well to tank component. We also looked at building and manufacturing transport infrastructure in cities. So basically, this is important to compare across different urban modes, some of which need a lot of infrastructure, for instance, rail modes, and have a different frequency of utilization of the infrastructure. So we thought that was important to include for a fair comparison. And last but not least, operational services, which are a key characteristic specific to the new mobility, which, for example, need repositioning or charging, if you think about micromobility, or need to drive around with our passengers in order to pick some others in the case of ride sourcing. And these are obviously, this is a component of the life cycle that leads to energy consumption and emissions and shall be taken care of when looking at the problem. And the point is, so far, not many studies have been looking at these components across the board for the different options we have available in cities. So to do this, we try to ensure consistency with so we built basically on the shoulder of what has already been done. in particular work of the Ergo National Lab with the GREET model, and also other important work, for example, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which has done extensive work on the well-to-wheel emissions. We needed to accept some degree of simplification because there's a lot of stuff. We had to use assumptions. It's normal in LCA, but we believe that we informed our work in a very accurate way. So the key findings, you have them here on screen. So to the right, you have greenhouse gas emissions per passenger kilometers in grams of CO2 per passenger kilometers. What we found is that, well, commuter bikes, mopeds, metros, and buses have a better performance when it comes to energy and greenhouse gas emission impacts if compared with cars. We found also that micromobility has energy and greenhouse gas emission impacts that, if they are properly managed, so if you manage to avoid wasting or avoid scrapping the vehicles too early, they can be comparable in magnitude with metros and buses. So even though locally things may be different, we are talking about a pool of modes that can belong to a more sustainable type of framework. We found that private micromobility vehicles perform better than shared. And we also found that ride sourcing services, in particular transport network companies, or have the highest energy and greenhouse gas emissions on a passenger kilometer basis. I'm happy to develop on that. Maybe there will be questions in the Q&A. The impacts in terms of energy and emissions vary on the basis of technology used for vehicle propulsion. So depending on whether or not, for example, your vehicle is electrified or electric, you have a different rate of emissions. In general, when it comes to especially new mobility, the good practices can lead to significant improvements. This is true both in terms of technology choice, but also in terms of operational practices. In vice versa, if you don't adopt good practices, you adopt poor practices, you may actually have significant adverse effects. Due to this, we developed a number of sensitivity cases around the figures that you see here, and those are elaborated and discussed in the report. This is one of the figures we have in the report, which focuses specifically on ride sourcing, given the big impacts, and looking at different options. For example, what happens if you increase the size of the vehicle? What happens if you make the battery smaller? What happens if you switch to green electricity? So the high level findings that we found while looking at this is that given the big impact, it's important to transition the vehicles, the ride sourcing vehicles, towards the most energy efficient and low carbon forms. And this is, by the way, not just a matter of impact, it's also a matter of better economics. So if you look at the vehicles that should transition first towards lower carbon and more energy efficiency, normally it's quite logical to think that these vehicles should be those with the highest operational costs, since by using energy efficient solutions, you can reduce the operational cost. And so you can, despite a higher purchase cost, you can have a quicker return on the investment. It's important amongst these vehicles, so it's important to focus on those that have the highest lifetime. And we also found that since labor policy look into the ensuring that you tend to have a more stable relationship between an employer and employee, those tend to also come with a higher frequency of high lifetime mileage profiles, and therefore could align well with the minimization of greenhouse gas emissions and reduction of energy, and the maximization of energy efficiency. Another important thing is that if you maximize load and minimize the heading kilometer, which are the kilometers you run empty to actually collect passengers, you can also achieve reductions in emissions per passenger kilometers. So this means that there are significant opportunities if you look at this new mobility, right, sourcing from the perspective of environment and energy, to ensure that you are doing well. If you think about on-demand shuttle services, because they can come with lower dead-end distances with respect to the distance you have with passenger on board, and more people carried on shared rides, so higher occupancy. If you look at e-scooters, we did look at that as a most representative case, let's say, of micromobility, and as a big booming element in the space of new mobility. In this case, we looked at two different generations of e-scooters. The first generation is shown on the graph. What you see here is that there are key parameters that basically change the impact of e-scooters. We have a central case, which is the red line, and then we have a variety of possible results that essentially depend on the daily distance traveled, the lifetime of the vehicles, the carbon embedded in particular in the aluminium used for the vehicle manufacture, the way you service the scooters. So the more scooters you service by a single trip, the lower are the emissions for each of them. The distance that the servicing vehicle travels, so and the energy efficiency and intensity of fuel and carbon intensity of the fuel used of these servicing vehicles. Last but not least, battery capacity also matters, since you have embedded emissions in the manufacturing of the batteries. Well, this is generally speaking, the higher the activity, useful activity, and the lifetime you manage to have on the vehicles, the better the environmental performance, the lower the emissions required to actually service and ensure operations, the better the environmental performance. We also looked at the new generation of scooters. So these are cases where you have longer lifetimes, but also often larger batteries, or more than a single batteries if you're using battery swapping. So generally speaking, what we found is that if you accept the idea that these vehicles come with a longer lifetime, which I think is what they are designed for, so it's likely, then they tend to have better performances compared to the first generations. And then in general, we also found that like in the first generation, you can achieve further improvements with respect to what we assessed as a central case if you enable to achieve higher daily distances traveled. If you, for example, bring in low carbon vehicles to ensure operational services, such as electric vehicles. If you ensure, for example, that the vehicle is made from materials that are less carbon intensive, a key example is aluminium produced from hydroelectricity rather than from coal-based electricity in the manufacturing phase, so in the aluminium production phase. And as I mentioned before, reduction of distance driven per each active kilometer is another element that can help you get emissions down, and low carbon electricity as well, even though the direct impact of electricity on micromobility is fairly small. One more important finding that comes through across the report is that we try to look at combined trips. So we understand that not each of these vehicles that we compared can be considered as a direct replacement, one-to-one, one for the other. So we looked in particular at combining public transport and micromobility, and combining public transport and ride sourcing, and see how that performs versus the case of private vehicles. And the key point that comes through while looking at that is that actually there is scope for ensuring that the combination of for example, micromobility as a feeder service into public transport ensures that you have a greater capacity to compete with cars for longer distance trips, while ensuring that greenhouse gas emissions per passenger kilometer remain much lower. So, and that is also true to some extent for ride sourcing. It really depends on the extent to which you rely on public transport and ride sourcing to complement it, or if you have a greater share of ride sourcing. So in that case, you struggle more to ensure low greenhouse gas emissions. One more slide on the combined trips to say that so far, so we did a review of, we leveraged work done by others to review what has happened so far in terms of replacement of different modes of transport by new mobility. What I want to say here is that if you want to make sure that a transition to this new mobility comes with net benefits for greenhouse gas emissions and energy demand per passenger kilometer, you need to ensure that you're basically replacing car trips with combined trips, combined trips. And this is something that so far has not really been proven easy to achieve. So it will be important to increase the value proposition of the alternative to cars to make sure that we evolve towards a more climate-friendly type of development. To summarize, we see as priorities for action to ensure that there's a good fit between new mobility and climate and energy efficiency goals. We see priorities are in the increase in the number of passengers transported per every vehicle kilometer. So I gave you the example before, the shared van versus car-based ride sourcing. We see operational improvements as an important instrument to reduce the amount of energy and greenhouse gases per passenger kilometer. So in particular, we need to increase the ratio of useful passenger kilometer per servicing vehicle kilometers. We need a rapid transition towards more energy efficient and low or zero emission vehicles or zero emission enabling vehicles and low carbon energy vectors. We need design solutions which are capable to extend lifetimes. And we also need to make sure that we avoid relying on heavy cars. We'd rather prefer smaller cars. And we managed to effectively integrate new mobility with urban transport. That's just the key points that emerge from trying to assess these things from a technical perspective, if you want the solutions. How do these convert in terms of recommendations? So one point that I didn't really touch upon is the fact that a lot of this work really went through quite a bit of struggle in terms of finding good data. Part of the reason for this is that there's no clear reporting framework. There's no mandatory reporting framework right now. Some of the data are available, others really need to be chased. Well, then what we are suggesting is that first you need to try to get more accurate information about the full life cycle impacts of these modes, so you need better data. And you need instruments allowing public authorities to actually get access to the data. Standardizing methodologies for the evaluation of the life cycle emissions and the actual data that you need and the way you measure them is an important step to ensure that you can actually do that in a way that is sound and logical. And then, so especially in the case of micromobility, and then increasing the capacity of micromobility to develop synergies with public transport, so become part of an alternative that offers a significant value proposition when it comes to replacing car travel in cities is another important priority. So here we have examples of different solutions. I want to flag two. One is the provision of adequate and safe road space for shared and owned micromobility. The other one is the integration of micromobility in the context of an offer that can come through mobility as a service platforms that can indeed increase this alternative value proposition to car travel. Last slide, and it's a focus on right sourcing. So it's clear that right sourcing amongst the options we looked is the one that comes with a significant environmental and greenhouse gas emission impact. So, and it's also clear that to a good extent, it relies on high mileage vehicles. Well, then a key recommendation we have is transitioning towards more energy efficient and low carbon energy forms in order to ensure that you can benefit from cost reductions that are available for highly utilized vehicles. We don't think we think some measures which are developed for all vehicles will be implicitly more compelling for highly utilized vehicles. And these are those, for example, that deal with regulating access to parts of the city. We also think that if governments want to take targeted measures, they should look first at the vehicles with these elevated levels of travel. Not all vehicles providing ride sourcing services are like that. So there's an interesting development on the policy side, which is the Clean My standard, which currently exists in California, which we see as an interesting example of where things could go. And then the other key pillar is encouraging higher occupancy. This could be achieved through minimum occupancy standards for ride sourcing, or it could also be achieved through incentives such as targeted curb access rules for pickup and drop off, or which are differentiated based on load factors, essentially, for example, favoring pop-up shared ride sourcing services with respect to the single passenger, single car type of service. I'll stop it here in the interest of time. I hope I was clear enough, and I'm sure Michael is already not happy with me probably going a little overboard.
Thank you very much, Pierpaolo. I appreciate the difficulty of summarizing a report like this in 10 minutes. But then, of course, we do want to have a discussion as well and give our friends and partners out there the opportunity to quiz you a little bit on some of the things. And I have a number of questions here. If there are any more, please put them into the Q&A chat now. I'll pass them on. Let me start with one from Marine Gorner, who asks whether you could elaborate a little bit on the total volume of activity that ride sourcing and micromobility options generate. You know, what are we talking about in terms of volume? And then what conclusions do we draw from the volume that we have about the priorities for ensuring that this mobility actually has an impact on issues like social justice and emissions?
Okay, so on the volume, what I can say is I understand that. So we included in the report some numbers about how big are these new mobility services. We have a number, an estimate, which is for 2018 of about 20 billion rides for ride sourcing. And I understand that we're probably close to something like 500 million when it comes to micromobility. There was recently Lime announced 150 million. If you multiply that by some 3-4 for different operators, you get to about 500 million. And then a ride sourcing trip, you can say roughly 10 kilometers, and micromobility trip maybe roughly 4. So if you just multiply, you get something like 200 billion vehicle kilometers on ride sourcing, and about a tiny fraction when you look at micromobility. So my understanding is there's a ratio that is weights much more for ride sourcing in terms of weight, in terms of vehicle kilometers, as opposed to micromobility as things stand right now. So this is, I think, as important implications, because basically it means that amongst the modes that we have been looking at, ride sourcing, which is one with big impact, is one that also weighs more in terms of volumes of travel. And so my personal view is that this is probably one of the things that we need to look at with greater priority. I mean, just this volume. Having said this, the dynamics are also open for changes. And I don't think we should just look at one option. We should try to really think about solutions that can become better enabler of a different model choice in cities. And so that means that, well, that wouldn't work if we don't also look at ensuring that the image and the capacity of alternatives, in particular micromobility vehicles, is fit to serve the purpose of meeting environmental goals. So that doesn't mean that you would only focus on ride sourcing. Well, let's put it like that. I think there's value in looking at.
Yeah. Let me throw a second question to you which comes from Franco Gonzalez in the UK, who's obviously read the report and has a detailed question about a table on page 27. But the issue is the following one. So the results seem to say that shared battery electric vehicle mopeds have higher emissions than private BEV mopeds. Same question for e-bikes. So what areas of vehicle design and operation changes have more impact in reducing this difference in emissions, is his question.
Okay, a lot depends on the assumptions you have on the duration and the use of these vehicles. So on the lifetime and the use of these vehicles. The more you manage to ensure that the lifetime is high, the better is going to be, so the lower is going to be the energy or the emission impact per unit of use. If you have vehicles that are exposed to tampering and basically being destroyed and not being not designed to ensure that they can have a longer lifetime if left on the road, you risk basically to end up in a situation with worse energy and environmental performances. If you ensure that your design characteristics are such that the lifetime can be longer, you end up also having net benefits in terms of energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a very wide range of data, of data points on lifetimes for these vehicles. What I think is very clear is that when it comes to micromobility, this has been well understood. There's been a transition across different generations of designs towards something that tries to account for that and reduces likelihood of the vehicles being tampered. And so that's an important development. Other important development is like you need servicing. You don't need the servicing in the case of the own vehicle. And then you need to ensure that you manage to service the vehicles in a way that minimizes the amount of kilometers that you need to run around with another vehicle to allow these vehicles to operate. And so there are different solutions. Not all operators have been using the same. There is some opted for example, swappable batteries, which allow for like just servicing the batteries and not the whole vehicle. Others prefer to focus on the whole vehicle still, but increasing the amount of vehicles that can be serviced by servicing vehicles. Many have been opting for using electric vehicles to service these, or even electric bikes. So there are a number of good practices that already popped up, and they should be replicated and used more broadly to ensure that the net impact will go down. That's the best I can say.
I have two more questions which cover different areas, but I'll pose them together just to give you the opportunity. The one concerns freight and logistics, and this is from Rob Whitehead, also in the UK Centre for London. Assuming your report covers passenger mobility only, which is the case, what lessons might we draw from it for freight, logistics and servicing journeys? Some of that you've just answered with the servicing part. And the other question is about emission charges. So based on the results, do we think that cities should consider emission charges for different transport modes based on this type of analysis?
Sorry, I couldn't get the second one, the emission charges?
Emission charges. So
emission charges, okay.
Based on this kind of analysis over the life cycle and very differentiated for different modes, would that be an approach that could be pursued?
Okay. So on freight logistics, we have a report in the pipeline which is going to be talking about freight logistics. So that counts as a nice question. So one common point of what we talked about now and freight logistics is the fact that we are talking about often about vehicles that have high lifetime mileage. So if you think about a light commercial vehicle used for urban deliveries, and the right sourcing vehicles, one of those with a high lifetime mileage, so that gets used extensively. They're both characterized by comparatively high operational costs compared to a conventional vehicle, conventional car, for example. So that means that both would benefit from transitioning towards a more energy efficient powertrain, and would actually end up delivering net benefits, even in terms of economics, for the cost per kilometer operated, even once you account for higher investment costs. So what we say here about right sourcing and the need to transition towards to better efficiency, lower emissions, and the fact that this can come with economic benefits, well, that's also true for light commercial, for example. There are also other possibilities in terms of switching across different modes, but this really wasn't the focus, and I think there could also be like this right sizing element. Depending on the type of delivery, you may want to pick a different type of vehicle, and that may also come with advantages in terms of greenhouse gas and energy consumption. When it comes to charges, so differentiate, I guess emission charges means differentiated access charges, for example. These are measures that exist either in terms of access, either in terms of applying charges for access, for example, in a part of the city. And some cities are already using a differentiation based on the environmental performance of the vehicles to promote the more environmentally performing vehicles. This is something that we think should be applied across the board without targeting specifically specific types of vehicles, because it's something that anyway is relevant for the overall volume of traffic. I don't think there's a specific case, even though I think naturally this type of measures will place a greater emphasis on vehicles that are used for serving, like ride sourcing or taxis, because they have a greater interest to operate in these parts of the city than conventional cars. And well, I believe that the measures should be taken apply across the board and not really only targeting this type of vehicles in this case. So this is also something that emerged from other work that ITF did on the regulation of app-based mobility services. That I highly recommend people to read if they're interested in this, because it was an important resource for us while working on this report.
Thank you very much. We're past our allotted 30 minutes, and I'm conscious that there are a couple of questions there which haven't been answered. I would like to nevertheless kind of end this now. The purpose of this format is really to give you the opportunity to take in a lot of information within a short time and to ask questions. If you have questions, do contact us. Just reach out, send us an email, get in touch via LinkedIn. We're very happy to kind of carry this discussion on in other formats. I would like to thank you all for attending, for being very, very active in the chat and also in the questions. And I would like to turn over to my colleague Sharon Masterson, who will tell us a little bit about what's behind this project, which, as I said, was initiated by our Corporate Partnership Board. While I'm doing that, you'll see something pop up on your screen, which is a poll. We just would like you to answer 2 questions for us to get a better understanding of whether this is useful for you or not, and to improve the format. The numbers tell me that it's of interest, which is good, and we look forward to having you again in the future. Subscribe to our newsletters and updates, and you'll find out when the next Ask the Author is here. And with that, I would like to thank Pierpaolo and hand over to Sharon. Sharon, please.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll keep it really short, just to give you a brief introduction to our Corporate Partnership Board, and also to answer one of the questions that I see has cropped up in the chat and the questions. So our Corporate Partnership Board was set up in 2014 with the idea to get the insights of the companies and corporate sector into our policy making, into our advice for policymakers. So it allows us to have the benefit from companies, but it also allows companies to benefit by participating in our policy discussions upstream, with a view to getting publications out for policymakers to read ahead of important policy decisions. Pierpaolo introduced our second report that was released this year. Our first one was on safe micromobility, and that was launched at the Ministerial Conference on Road Safety in Stockholm in February of this year. And that I'd like to highlight that because I see a question from Nathaniel and from Christoph on categorizing the vehicles. And in that report called Safe Micromobility, we have done just that. So I think you'll find that a good reference, and have a look, you'll find that on our website under the Corporate Partnership Board section reports. So it's called Safe Micromobility. Just in terms of the other work that we're doing, we are also going to launch a report this year on blockchain and supply chain and logistics. And we've also released one this year on the initiatives that our Corporate Partnership Board members have undertaken related to COVID-19. Next year's projects will be on rules and principles for public value data sharing, data-driven approaches to building, maintaining and extending the safe life of transport infrastructure. And we'll also look at the impact of urban freight and parcel delivery on the curb. And of course that is has grown more and more important with the onset of COVID. We'll also hold a workshop on data bias and gender perspective within the transport sector. And we'll do a survey of our 62 member countries on automated driving regulatory frameworks and priorities to see where things are at in their countries. And all of our partners, all of our corporate partners are involved as well in the large multi-year, multi-stakeholder initiative that we have on decarbonising transport. So that's just a quick overview to let you know what's coming up for the rest of the year and what we're going to start working on. All of the other information and all of these reports are available, as Michael said, on our website. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And just a quick reminder, I put the link to the report into the chat. If you haven't had a look at it, you can download it for free. Also, if you're interested in this topic and other topics, go to our website, click on the subscribe button at the top right, and sign up for our publication alerts, which will give you, as soon as we put something out, you receive just a very short email with a blurb, back cover blurb to tell you what it's about, and a link to download the report or to a session like this one today, Ask the Author. Thank you very much for your time. It was great having you. Do come again, do spread the word, and I'm sure it'll be very soon when we meet again to talk about this topic, micromobility. Thank you all very much and have a good day. Bye. Bye-bye.